Another video, another IEM. Here we go again with more confusion in the already bloated IEM market. This time we take a look at the Moondrop Blessing 3, a fairly new release from this company. The folks at Apos Audio kindly loaned me the Blessing 3 for many weeks. As you know, Apos is among a handful of online retailers that specialize in hi-fi and audiophile gear. Yeah, basically the same thing. They have a wide variety of gadgets to drool over. If you're looking for a gift this coming holiday season, even for yourself, check them out. Now, let's talk about this $320 IEM. Moondrop says that the new Blessing has an innovative design for authentic sound. They promise accurate sound reproduction, strong dynamics, and low distortion. One of the aspects that Moondrop highlights is the Blessing 3's improved bass performance, which now should produce higher dynamic range, though the company does not say what we should compare these advancements to. I suppose the last iteration of the Blessing. Moondrop spends an extraordinary amount of marketing time underscoring the build and 3D printing and unique design. Check that out if this is something which excites you. The company provides a frequency response graph. This shows a U-curve with a sharp emphasis at 3 kHz, the point that is traditionally a factor for sibilants. As for build, the Blessing 3 is a pretty chunky IEM. It's bigger than the Tin Hi-Fi T2, Moondrop Aria, and Starfield, and even rivals the Blonde BL Max. The Blessing is made principally of plastic. There's a metallic faceplate to give it some character. The Blessing is fairly light, which is a saving grace for something this large. The Blessing has a fairly typical outward design. There's nothing in appearance that has not been replicated many times before. That could be a good thing for anybody who does not want to draw attention. The IEM comes with 3.5mm 2-pin cable. There's nothing special about this cable. It tends to transmit a noticeable amount of microphonics when rubbed against clothes, desk, well, nearly anything. The Blessing comes with a very rudimentary assortment of accessories. We get a hard case that flips open and a handful of silicone ear tips. And that's it. Now, as far as fit is concerned, I found the Blessing 3 to be very comfortable indeed. Its lightweight design and kind of its triangular shape allowed it to sit fairly comfortably in my ear. Overall, the Blessing 3 in outward appearance has very little going for it. The pitiful accessories we get for $320 can be easily outmatched by IEMs that cost a fraction of this price. But its comfort is pretty good. Moondrop does not actually say what the sound signature is supposed to be. Their frequency response graph suggests a U-shape or maybe even a balanced sound. I used the Blessing for over a month as one of my primary IEMs. I paired them with my FIO BTR7, Low 2 PAW S1, Matrix Mini I, the original, Ego Zerta ITM03, and plugged it straight into the headphone sockets of those few devices that still have them. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and streamed lossy content on Spotify and YouTube, and consumed a wide assortment of other digital media, including TV shows and movies, while using the Blessing 3. Moondrop promises some kind of improvement where the Blessing 3's bass is concerned. I have not heard any of the previous versions of this IEM, so I have no way of knowing if this is actually the case. In my opinion, the Blessing has a fairly neutral bass. The sub-bass has a marginal roll-off, but nothing remotely like what you would hear on the Tin Hi-Fi T2, for example. The Moondrop Quarks have a slightly greater bass emphasis in comparison. The mid-bass on the Blessing is clearer than that of the Quarks and the Aria. Separation of bass elements is more obvious on the Blessing. It is similar to the bass clarity found on the Campfire Audio Andromeda. Drum strikes are hard, precise, and a little sharp. They have a visceral, thwacking effect. The Aria and Quarks have a more blunted, less sharp presentation. The Andromeda also has a slightly less impactful bass response or drum hit than the Blessing. Bass transients is fastest on the Blessing compared to the Quarks, Aria, and Andromeda, but the bass transients of the Tin Hi-Fi T2 beats all of them. In Conquer and Irodori, two of my bass test tracks, the Blessing clearly separated the various drums in both songs. There was no muddiness or veiled signature. The various sizes and differing sounds of the Japanese drums in Irodori clearly shone through. In contrast, on the Aria and Quarks, these drums mostly melded together. The Andromeda was slightly less clear than the Blessing in this regard. The mids on the Blessing are slightly forward. Vocals stand clear and apart from instruments. Drums, guitars, flutes, pianos, every instrument is present, but do not drown out the principal singer. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, the Blessing had no trouble presenting Orla's voice throughout the track. Even the backup singer that pops into the left ear at 2 minutes and 40 seconds was abundantly clear, separate, and despite all the instruments playing at maximum. In comparison, the Aria, Quarks, and Andromeda were not nearly as clear. The Quarks had the most neutral presentation, and the Aria had the vocal stand further back muddled with the drums. The Blessing, however, does emphasize vocal sibilance. It is not as obvious as on the Tin Hi-Fi T2 and seemed fairly similar to what I heard on the Aria. The Andromeda has a more neutral presentation, with no emphasis of vocal sibilance. The Quarks are neutral in this regard as well. In Want You Back by Haim, the Blessing again showed that it does in fact emphasize sibilance. Not ear-piercing, but also not neutral. However, the subtle details, such as the growling voice at 8 seconds into the song, the two backup vocalists in either channel, came through very clearly. Even when the instruments played at maximum, all three vocalists mostly remained separate, their individual tonalities audibly different. The Aria hid these subtleties. The Quarks and Andromeda did not present them as obviously as the Blessing, and the Tin Hi-Fi T2 brought out these details somewhat similarly to the Blessing, but nearly not as clear. As for treble, the Blessing seems to have a fairly neutral rendition. Now there might be a marginal emphasis in the low to mid treble, but this is a far cry from the hot treble of the Tin Hi-Fi T2, or Blonde BL03 or BL05. The Aria has a marginal emphasis in the lower treble. The Quarks and Andromeda are neutral, though not quite as clear as the Blessing. In Flight from the City, the Blessing easily reproduced the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood, and the distinct signatures of the piano and cello. There was little to no muddiness or melding among all these elements, and with a bit of concentration, I could pick any of them out at my leisure. In Take 5 with the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Blessing accurately parsed out the various instruments, left, right, center, and behind. The saxophone was the loudest instrument in the mix, and the cymbals were a close second. All elements were separate and, as you guessed it by now, clear. In contrast, the Aria blended all the instruments together. The Quarks did similarly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 parsed them out, but not as clearly as the Blessing, and the Andromeda was somewhere in the middle in this regard. As for detail retrieval, the Blessing is a surprisingly capable IEM. Subtle elements in the mix seem reasonably audible. Nuanced, tiny background details might not always be apparent, but at least with my time with the Blessing, I heard those details more often than not. Creaking of wood, sharp intakes of breaths, gravelly natures of vocals, twangs of guitar strings, electric buzzing, multiple layered vocals. These types of details were quite clear on the Blessing. For a more quantitative test, I listened to Kazuki's song New Light. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The first footstep, if you are following along, is at exactly 11 seconds. That is the sound I am referring to. The Blessing 3 in this test rendered 16 clear footsteps. This is the highest score in my IEM detail test of all time. Compared to the T2, which renders 8 footsteps, the MS2 with 9, the Starfield and Aria, which presents 6 to 7, the BL03, which renders a measly 5 to 6 footsteps. Now, the next closest achiever on this scale is the WGT2, a Tesla driver IEM, which topped out at 10 to 11 footsteps. Finally, when it comes to Soundstage, the Blessing 3 is slightly above average. Soundstage is a multi-factor impression. The original recording, ear tips, fit, and sufficient power for peak performance all have competing roles in the experience. I use the Starfield and Aria as my benchmark. These are what I call average for Soundstage. Thus, compared in this manner, the Tin Hi-Fi T2 is above average, and the Blonde BL03 and 05 are typically below average. The Blessing 3, along with the Andromeda, is slightly above average. It sounds a bit less wide than the T2. So, there you have it. When I got the Blessing 3, I was pretty skeptical. Having reviewed dozens and dozens of IEMs from China, I've gotten a bit sick of the same old aggressive chi-fi tuning. When I stumble onto a more neutral presentation, I am ecstatic. And now, with the Blessing 3, well, I'd say this IEM is an interesting mix of neutral with chi-fi excitement. The bass is close to neutral, so is the treble. The mids are a little bit forward, and there is definitely a noticeable, but not in my opinion, harsh, sibilance push. The Blessing has clarity, the type that many other companies boast about but do not deliver. The Soundstage is nothing impressive, but given the hard, fast, impactful bass and detail, it sounds perfectly appropriate for this IEM. Now, the big question, is this IEM worth $320? Well, look at it objectively and also subjectively. Objectively, no. The build and accessories simply do not justify several $100s for the Blessing 3. Subjectively, yeah, maybe. If this is the sound signature you have been craving, then clearly you will find a way to justify the expenditure. In my opinion, I think Moondrop should have put in more effort when charging this much money. A greater variety of ear tips and a better cable that does not transmit as much microphonics as the stock cable does would have been the right choice. Having said all that, there is truly something unique about the Blessing 3. The tuning is, in my very subjective impression, intoxicating. In conclusion, the Blessing 3 is a surprisingly good IEM. It costs a lot of money, but if you've got the cash to spend and this is the signature and performance you're looking for, then I think this IEM should be on your short list to consider.